Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is, I have a hard time believing this. This is the second anniversary of Everyday Anarchism. I am doing this podcast. I have been doing it for 2 years. My guest today is Ruth Kinna, who was one of my earliest guests. I think you were my third guest. You were also my guest for the first anniversary episode. I think you're the most frequent guest, and there was only one person to invite back on for the second anniversary episode. So, Ruth, thank you so much for joining me for this one more anniversary episode. Hopefully, there'll be a third.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back.
It's such a pleasure, and I should say that some episodes generate a few emails and some episodes generate no emails, but the episodes I've done with you, Ruth, have been some of the most consistently praised episodes from the listeners. So
Well,
it's
that's
just
nice to
been
know.
yes. Well, you should. That's why I told you, because I thought it would be nice to know. So everyone who has listened to this podcast probably knows who you are, but I'll just say by way of introduction that you are, in my opinion, one of the leading figures in what we could call anarchist studies or anarchist academia, the intellectual field of study and production on anarchism, which I would say this podcast is also a very small and less professionalized branch of anarchist studies. So I've invited you on to discuss this topic because it's one that I hear occasionally out there, sort of that anarchist studies is um, perhaps a waste of time, or
Mhm.
at least some of the activists, let's say this, people who consider themselves anarchists and are out there living anarchic lives want to know what is the point of people like you and me, professors with PhDs, talking about these ideas and publishing books that no one can afford, and they just go
Yep.
into libraries and that sort of thing. And I should say that I don't think that's what you are doing with books like The Government of No One and the books of on anarchist constitution. So this is less a question about your work specifically, which is wonderful and I think everyone values, and more just this bigger question: what are we doing here if we are anarchists or trying to be anarchists, and yet we are academics or intellectuals? We don't seem to be the revolutionary subject. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we get it from both sides, actually. I mean, I think the academics don't really think that we're doing anything useful either.
I must agree with you. I must agree with you there. And a story I've told lots of times, but I'll just tell it again, is I wrote a dissertation on social change, progress, disorder in America from 1870 to 1920, and I did not mention the anarchists except for the fact that Jane Addams was willing to talk to them. I did
Uh-huh.
not encounter them, and not a single person on my committee was like, hey, maybe Emma Goldman should go in this dissertation. It's like, well, the idea that they would have suggested that the anarchists were part of this
Yeah.
moment was considered almost silly to talk
Yeah.
about anarchism, because
Yeah.
anarchists are silly and not worth talking about.
Yeah. And I think that's where I sort of started. That I mean, when I was when I was an undergraduate, and I first came across anarchism, I mean, I realised pretty quickly that there was a literature that, and that this was readily available to me. But I suppose I was sort of puzzled by the absence of the anarchists in non-anarchist literature, and yeah, and the actually what anarchists had to say about some of that literature. So one of the things that really struck me actually was, for example, the complete neglect of historians of ideas to think seriously about Bakunin's critique of Rousseau. uh, and I suppose that got me thinking, I mean, quite selfishly, about wanting to find out more. So I started as someone who really just wanted to find out more about Kropotkin and spend. I mean, it was a very selfish pastime, that I had 3 years of funding to sit there and I mean, it took me an awful lot longer, but to investigate these ideas and to think of anarchism as not exhaustively, but at least in part, a political theory. And I think that that's an important thing to think. And I think actually we or anarchists miss a trick if they don't cover all of the bases. So I agree that anarchism is a movement, that anarchism is a practice. I agree with all of that, but it is also a set of ideas and it's a political theory. And we learn as anarchists in engaging with that body of ideas. And I suppose that the position I've come to over time is that we contribute by trying to explain this properly to those who would otherwise refuse to engage with anarchism. So if you don't engage with non-anarchists in ways that they kind of understand, actually you leave the field open to precisely the people that activists absolutely hate, who want to tell anarchists what they believe and completely misrepresent them and distort their thinking in the process. So I don't want to speak for anybody when I talk about anarchism. I don't want to try and say that what I'm doing is more valuable than what anybody else is doing. But I do think that there's a gap there. And I think that those who are sympathetic to anarchism or who think of themselves as anarchists can do some valuable work in exploring that and explaining it to other people.
Uh, Ruth, I think unfortunately we're done with that question. You answered it so well. I mean, seriously though, I would say that's probably my answer as well. But I've never articulated it that well or been able to put it so precisely. And I guess to speak again biographically very briefly, I was one of those academics for whom anarchism had no value and was barely mentioned. I mean, I remember when uh, the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests started happening in the United States, which I believe was 2016. And it's hard. I just want to remind all the listeners, especially I know there's some younger listeners out there who barely remember 2016. Black Lives Matter, like the New Yorker ran an article in I think 2017 about Black Lives Matter as a failure, as something that had just not succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
And after what happened during COVID and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter in America and around the world in 2019, now there's BLM signs and t-shirts all over the United States. In 2017, 2018, Black Lives Matter was a joke. It was a failure. And anarchism was given as the explanation for Black Lives Matter's failure. You know, those guys in the 60s, they knew what they were doing. They organized, they had demands, they picked a very, very respectable and charismatic leader, that sort of thing. And I think in the 60s, in a lot of ways, were quite anarchic. But the civil rights playbook, and when I say those guys in the 60s, I mean Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean the yippies and the SDSers who were in many ways more anarchist, and that Black Lives Matter had just failed because it was embodying anarchist thoughts. It didn't have a leader, it didn't have a movement, it was inspired by Occupy Wall Street. And so anarchism was once again, as it has been for as long as there has been since the Palmer raids, I guess, anarchism was once again in the United States a joke, a failure, a historical mistake. It doesn't feel that way to me right now, post COVID, post the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, with the wave of union organizing we're seeing. It doesn't feel that way. And the fact that I was one of those people who was a historian of ideas and trying to find the ideas that would help the left organize in the early 21st century, and I missed anarchism and was among the group that was criticizing Black Lives Matter for being anarchists. If those of you who have listened to this podcast for the last 2 years can believe that, it's hard for me to not understand, to not value the work that people like you have been doing, Ruth, because when I came to find this set of ideas interesting and inspiring, I wouldn't have had any way through it or into it without people like you, your book, The Government of No One, and the anarchist studies work. I mean, I would say I've been talking too much. I'll turn it over. I would say that there's sort of, we can, or maybe we shouldn't divide sort of academic or intellectual anarchists into two groups. Sort of those who provide a theory from an intellectual position, and then those who study the theory from a more academic or scholarly tradition. I'm not sure that this distinction is really that valuable. But I would say that academics can do both of those things. They can do the theorizing and they can study the theories. And without academics doing that, I would have been lost when I set out to learn the ideas of this movement.
Yeah, I agree. So I think there's a lot of there's I think it's helpful to think about the grey areas. you know, so I mean, I suppose one of the roles of intellectuals, I guess. I think Chomsky is right. One of the roles of intellectuals is to use the platform, and partly to sort of if you like, speak truth to power, to try and show where the um, where the flaws in public reasoning lie, and to present a different way of thinking about the problems. Because so one of the things that he has done, I mean, consistently over all of these years, is to put the other case, is to sort of say, look, you can't just think of international relations in terms of this bipolar struggle, and that one side is good and the other side is bad. You might not agree with Chomsky's analysis, but one of the things that Chomsky has done, I think, is to show how an intellectual can take on their own government and reveal the lies, if you like, the political lies that are told in order to keep people passive. So that's a really important function. And I think that blurs quite seamlessly, if you like, into an idea that, or into an assumption that what we think and how we think about things matters. And that that changing the world, of course, you change the world. The way you change the world is by engaging with sort of material forces, but ideas are material forces too. And unless we have some sort of sense of what we mean by, even basic concepts, what we mean by being free, what we mean by being equal, what these things might or how translate into policy. It seems to me that we don't have a sensible politics, and that's what I think the 19th century anarchists were all about. Was thinking how familiar concepts, how ideas that were buried, I mean, in an American context, that were buried within the Constitution, actually could point to a very different set of values and priorities and practices and ways of life. And it's that engagement, if you like, with the political landscape that separates that gives the value to the role of the anarchist intellectual. So I would call someone like Josiah Warren an anarchist intellectual, even if he didn't call himself an anarchist. I mean, he certainly gives birth to a whole current of ideas that were and are anarchist, and it was an invaluable contribution.
Yeah, I agree, and I still haven't given Warren and some of those other people the time and attention either in my once I get time to study them myself, then the listeners, you will hear the results of that on this podcast. So that's something down the line. I do want to say that Chomsky is another. Um, I'm so glad you mentioned Chomsky because I, of course, as an undergraduate, was taught Chomsky, taking theory classes in the English department. It was impossible not to encounter Chomsky. But the fact that he was an avowed anarchist was not part of my
Mentioned.
knowledge of him. Maybe that
Mm.
was somewhere. And so Chomsky does seem to me to be a key figure because he is someone who is respected across the left, and indeed is given the the same sort of respect that people like Michel Foucault
Mm-hmm.
and Judith Butler are given on the right, in that they're a thinker who the right hates very much and laments
Mm,
that they are being taught to American high school and college students.
mm,
And for this figure, who everyone agrees on is a towering figure of the American left, a great awakener, or indeed, the great deceiver of America's youth, depending on your
mm.
perspective, to see that he's an anarchist, to me, opened up a field. And when I say, like, oh, I'm an anarchist, and people say, like, blah blah blah, whatever, anarchism is dumb, and it's like, don't you like Chomsky? And they'll say something like, oh, I didn't know he was an anarchist, or yeah, I guess he kind of is an anarchist, isn't he? So I think Chomsky is a great person to mention in this.
Yeah,
He has been doing the work of an anarchist intellectual in terms that anyone who reads the New York Times opinion page can follow and understand. And I mean, it seems like that's what we should all be doing. Well, that's what Chomsky says all of us
yeah,
intellectuals should be doing.
yeah. I think that's right, and I think that his status, if you like, the profile that he has, his reputation, is also in itself important, because it then allows you to ask the question, well, what sort of anarchist is he? So you're opening up,
Yeah.
and I think that's the point, isn't it? That the anarchist intellectual is there not to be, is not there in order to, is not there as the technocrat, is not there as the authority, if you like. I mean, clearly he is incredibly authoritative about the minutiae of American foreign policy. But he stands there as someone who not only acknowledges but sort of celebrates his anarchist turn as a youth.
Mm-hmm.
And who has engaged with anarchist movements and talked about his influences, and particularly people like Rocker and the syndicalists, and all of this. And it doesn't have to be in depth. The fact is that he acknowledges this tradition, and that, as well as sort of promoting critique of government, also opens up the possibility of thinking about, well, what do we mean by anarchism? If we have someone there in front of us, someone really important, to start sort of thinking about that question. And I think that in itself is a service, actually.
Yeah, I agree. Listeners are maybe tired of hearing me mention this interview I did with Anthony Caldelis on the Byzantine Empire, but uh, Anthony's work, if you haven't listened to that episode, go listen to it, listeners, is about how the Byzantine Empire conceived itself as Roman, and how the Romans conceived themselves as a republic, and about how street protests were a legitimate form of the Roman republic. So the idea that something that we would call mob rule
Mm,
or anarchy was in fact, they didn't call it anarchy, but something that a conservative would call mob rule and disorder was a legitimate part of politics in the Byzantine Empire, that dread, Orientalist despotism, that Anthony is able to read it as an expression of democracy, I found so thrilling. And when I emailed him, I just thought, oh, this guy's going to think like I'm a joke. I think Byzantium is anarchism. And he immediately was like, yes, let's do this. And then I was listening to his podcast later, and he said, I grew up, this was not in conversation with me, but in conversation with someone else on his own podcast. He said, I grew up in Athens, but I really knew everything that was going on in America because, of course, I read Chomsky. And
mm,
that just made it click for Anthony, a teenage Chomskyan.
mm,
It wasn't weird that I thought the Byzantine Republic was kind of anarchistic. In fact, I'm sure I didn't ask him about this. His Chomskyan thinking is part of what led him to his views about the Byzantine Empire. And
mm,
so without Chomsky's, as you say, authoritative or legitimizing influence, not that we should consider him the authority
mm,
or legitimate, but that other figures outside of anarchism consider him a legitimate thinker
mm,
and an anarchist, has authorized some space for anarchism in a way that, of course, as an anarchist, I think is is bad. You shouldn't need a towering intellectual great old man to have your ideas be listened to. But within the world we live in, that's how the game is played,
That's
and
right.
his influence is crucial.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, he's unusual, if you like, because one, because he's been going for such a long time, and two, he sort of stood up as an anarchist, pretty early on. But I mean, he's unusual, I suppose, because there aren't that many people within his field of expertise who would label themselves in the same kind of way. But I would say that he has the same sort of significance as. I mean, it's important to remember, or to see the links between people and ideas. Um, so and you see this within the cultural sphere too. So film directors, authors, artists, there is a whole milieu of people who have who have thought of themselves as anarchist, or who have been on the fringes of anarchist movements. And when you start to put that picture together, and you see that there is actually, a deep rooted perspective on life, on things, that is anarchist or anarchistic, then actually it just helps you break down some of the orthodoxies. And so I think these things, this idea of there being an intellectual movement, is a really, really important thing.
Yeah, I agree. And there is no point of ideas if they don't make a difference in the world. That's Jamesian pragmatism 101, and it's very clear that the ideas of anarchism, whether they've come from Chomsky or anywhere else, have made a difference. I like this idea that ideas are also material things. I mean, fair enough. Everything is everything, and nothing is anything. Um,
I guess what I meant by that, I don't know if you know, I mean, Kropotkin's book,
yes,
on the French Revolution, um, and I think the first chapter is called "The Idea,"
yeah,
and
no,
and the argument is that, I mean, there are 2 points I guess he wants to make. One is that, I mean, which, I mean, that's more controversial, I guess, but the one idea is that, uh, anarchist intellectuals like Kropotkin were only expressing what they found in working class movements, or what they
mm.
found in grassroots movements. So I think that's a slightly disingenuous, but, I think, but I think the it's not entirely disingenuous. So what he's saying is that, having, if you listen to ordinary conversations and ordinary grievances, then you can build a picture of a problem and an aspiration to which you can give voice.
Mhm.
Um, and it's important that you do that, because the other argument of the French Revolution, why he starts with this thing called the idea, is that, he's conscious of the fact that at the point of the revolution, France has been unstable for a while, and something is going to give. The system can't hold, and his thinking is that when you come into a period of instability, so you could say, like the Arab Spring, or, I mean, any of these sort of recent movements that we've looked at, that the direction of travel is significantly influenced by the traction that ideas gain within movements. It's not just that, militaries will step in and hold guns to people's heads. I mean, they do that. But Kropotkin's argument was, in the context of France, the idea that prevailed was the idea of the bourgeoisie.
Mhm.
And the idea that didn't prevail was the idea of the working class, or the ordinary people. So what you have is, you have a movement that's being generated by an aspiration that is going to be defeated, because the other side, if you like, have already got their ducks in a row, and they know how they're going to implement and entrench, their political values. And it's not going to be for the common good, but you're going to be told that it's for the common good. And so his fear is that, unless we think about the kinds of aspirations we have and how they might translate, then we're always going to be subject to the prevailing logics.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's an excellent point, and I just want to say, I guess I'll leave that part in where I say, everything is everything and nothing is anything. That was me being too flippant. Let me try and put it in again Jamesian terms. I take the radically empirical view from James that distinctions like between ideas and
Mm,
things. When if Hegel says ideas are everything and Marx says no, things are everything, this is a ridiculous and false
yeah,
distinction. And obviously, things and ideas interpenetrate to the
yeah,
point of incomprehensibility. Not that they're incomprehensible, but pulling out an idea that leads you to do something in the material world, which creates ideas, which leads people to do something, it's obviously that they are intertwined
yeah,
in a way that, in a way that, the reason why I said that is because I'm skeptical whenever I start talking to a Marxist who tries to explain to me how things are more important than ideas,
yeah,
because ideas are things and things are
yeah,
ideas, I would
yeah,
say. And
yeah,
that gets you nowhere, except that it gets you out of a silly binary or a prevailing logic,
yeah,
as you're saying.
yeah, yeah, and it, yeah, and I guess I mean there's I think there's a link there too in the way that liberal democracies function, which again is something that Chomsky talks about in terms of manufacturing consent.
Yeah,
And you know the ideas,
absolutely.
are part and parcel of that.
Yeah, a couple of quick things I wanted to touch on what you had been saying earlier in terms of Kropotkin's view. So first of all, the idea that, as you say, the slightly disingenuous idea that he's just expressing the views of the working people. This is obviously the heart of the definition of everyday anarchism that I'm using, that comes from Graeber's little, like, "Are you an anarchist? The answer might surprise you," and in some ways is related
Hmm.
to Marx's baseline communism. I mean, I want to emphasize the everyday. Graeber's example of people get on the bus politely and friendlily, and if someone drops their backpack when they're getting on the bus, someone else
Let's pick it up.
picks it
Yeah.
up. Yeah, and there's no forced order there. The other thing, thinking about the anarchist milieu, the writers and the literary figures and the artists and everything, this struck me very hard when I started studying anarchism. The the textbooks in literature, the anthologies, what you read, you're forced to read John Milton as an undergraduate, right? And you read Blake and Shelley, and if you're an American, you read Emerson and Thoreau, and you might be able to read all those people without um, Kropotkin
Hmm.
or Godwin or Rousseau coming up. But every single one of those towering figures is, if not an anarchist, and I'm comfortable. I mean, Shelley, if Godwin is an anarchist, Percy Bysshe
Yeah,
Shelley is an
Shelley is.
anarchist,
Yeah, yeah.
obviously. So, and then the reason why I need to do a whole series on this at some point. The reason why artists get together and write manifestos is not because artists do that. It's because anarchists do that. And a group of anarchists called the Pointillists did this and got
Hmm.
together and wrote a manifesto. And now we say, oh, yeah, those artists, they are always writing manifestos and forming movements. No, it's completely backwards.
Mm,
Artists are informed by anarchism, starting with the pointillists, and that's
mm,
where this tradition comes from. So if you're thinking, oh, those artists, they're always forming groups and writing manifestos, it's because of
yeah,
anarchism. The history of art and literature and film in the past 2 centuries, at least in the Western world, it's pretty easy to read as a history of anarchism.
yeah.
And I double majored in literature and film studies as an undergraduate, and again, this this did not come up, and
Mm,
it's astonishing. I read my Chomsky and my Shelley and my Emerson, but the A word was never said.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It is interesting. I think it's also interesting the way that um, that some writers, or I mean, it seems to me, and I've been doing some work recently on Mary Wollstonecraft um, and the vindication of the rights of women, and it's been slated by many feminists over many years because it doesn't fit a standard socialist model. It seems to be a tract for bourgeois feminists, and I think it's a complete, I think it's a misreading, and I think one of the reasons that the misreading prevails is because alternative ways of thinking about uh, domination and the nature of oppression are kind of factored out
Mm.
through a class lens. I mean, if you look at her through a class lens, she looks a bit odd. But if you don't look at, I mean, if you look at her as a critic of republicanism, someone who is coming out precisely of that milieu of Godwin leading to Shelley and all of that, then she makes much better sense. And I think sometimes, we it's not only that we sort of airbrush anarchism out of our discussions, but we distort the people who are, in some ways really, really radical,
Hmm.
because we simply don't read them through an anarchistic lens.
Yeah, wonderful. That's something that I've got in mind for as this podcast goes on, of spending more and more time with these canonical cultural figures and showing their engagement with anarchism. Um, I mentioned a few other things that we could talk about if we have time, but maybe I'll set this aside at least for now and say one thing that struck me as you were talking and mentioning Chomsky, and then I told my like micro history of how anarchism was perceived in 2016
Mm-hmm.
versus how it's perceived in 2021. There's obvious reasons. I mean, the pandemic is the fulcrum on which that particular world moved. But I'm wondering, and this is putting you on the spot, can you speak to sort of the change in the perception of anarchism that you've seen, or has there been one over the past few decades? Is it How is it different from when you started out to now? Are figures like Graeber or events like Occupy Wall Street, did they make a difference, or have you just sort of been, in your anarchist silo apart from the rest of the world, which denies the value of anarchism, or I'm saying denied the value of anarchism until 3 years ago?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be in my little bubble, but I guess the thing that really changed public perceptions was the social justice movement, 1999, early 2000s. So that was again a very diverse movement, but it was labeled anarchist because it
Mm.
didn't fit a party political model, right? And organizationally, it seemed to speak to anarchist principles, leaderlessness and horizontalism and no programs, having benchmarks instead, all of this. And I think that was really helpful in some ways. I mean, it stimulated a lot of debate about what was the relationship between a horizontalist movement and an anarchist movement, and all of this literature in social movement studies. But it put anarchism back on the map.
Mm.
And I think it really sort of drew attention to groups of anarchists, I mean, particularly in America, but not just America, who had been, working for years and years, under the radar, and suddenly, they became, I mean, I wouldn't say sort of everyday currency, but I mean, people started to know about Fifth Estate. I mean, they started to engage again with, I mean, and the same in Europe too, that there were, groups that had been working for years, who suddenly gained traction, who gained attention. People like Colin Ward gained, some academic attention. So I think that was the big thing that changed everything. But I suppose it also then kick-started a debate about theory and practice, organization versus ideology, and the whole kind of rerun of a debate about what is anarchism. And I'm not sure that was entirely fruitful, but it was better than not having a discussion.
Mm.
And I think there was a recognition fairly generally across, I mean, coinciding, I mean, or shortly coming after the collapse of Soviet communism, it did sort of flag a realignment on the left, a general kind of anarchist turn. Um, So I think that was the thing that changed, and there were all sorts of of good things that came out of that about the relationship between anarchists and feminists, anarchists and indigenous movements, anarchism and
Right.
and all and as you say, Black Lives Matter, and I and from that you also then, I mean, particularly through things like Black Lives Matter, uh, you get the possibility of interrogating much deeper convergences between abolitionists, the relationship between anarchists and people like Angela Davis. There becomes a different way of thinking about what a left could be. And all of that, I think, is pretty positive.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree that it's positive. Um, Now let me give you another potential controversy because I certainly have encountered this narrative that it's this movement that arises in the late 90s, and the flashpoint is the battle in
Seattle.
Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
which I was 15, 16 when that happened and did not know what was going on. I mean, I don't remember taking a personal stance, but just like what is happening. I mean, I had no framework to understand the battle in Seattle. There is a movement out there, though, Ruth. I mean, I'm sure you know these people as well as knowing of these people that wants to argue that anarchism became a sort of bourgeois movement in that moment, that it lost its ability to organize the working class and became like children of professors, children of doctors, children of engineers. And despite all of the attempts to talk about feminism and indigeneity and abolition and race, the anarchist movement post the battle in Seattle is, I mean, trust fund kids is going a little too far, but at least there's that idea out there that
Mm.
everyone in an anarchist squat actually has a trust fund, and I'm wondering. Obviously, that's not true. I don't. You don't need to speak to that at all because that's a ridiculous caricature. But I'm wondering if you see that there is this divide that at least some activists claim that anarchism as it exists now is a sort of plaything for young people to use to rebel against their parents, as opposed to something that could actually organize large groups of people against the system.
Mm. So I think there's, I mean, I think the rebellion thing, that was a point that was also made about the 60s, right?
Yes,
That this was
excellent
just a
point.
kind of a generational divide. It would burn itself out. Anarchists, you never found an anarchist who was over 25, apart from Chomsky. but I mean, it seems to me that the thing that the global justice movement did was put global injustice on the map. And so if you say, the focus of the politics was uh, on that global inequality, then perhaps there's a case for saying some of the inequalities within the global north were bypassed or glossed over, and perhaps there's also, maybe that opens up the space then for the subsequent sort of recuperation of that critique of globalization by the right and the so-called left behinds, and that politics of Trumpist politics and populist politics. So I think there's a point to that, but I think it's unfair in the sense that it suggests that there was no class dynamic in that analysis. I think that the class dynamic was there. It just that it was focused on the way in which global north and global south was operating. And if you think about things like, I mean, one of the big books that came out of that movement was No Logo. I mean, actually, one of the things that No Logo did was focus attention on the really brutal exploitation of working classes in the Far East, that were sustaining, sort of lifestyles that the West was enjoying, that the North was enjoying. So I think um, definitely there was a shift, but I don't think it's fair to say that there was no appreciation of class within it. It's just that its reach was broader.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it's if you're, I mean, from my perspective, at least living in the United States, the various questions you raise related to the problems within the United States and I mean I usually say instead of the global north I like center periphery
Yeah,
because because with the sense that there's also a million nodes on
yeah,
this. So the father in a patriarchal family can be at the periphery at his shitty job, but then the wife or the children are at the periphery at the home. I like that as
yeah,
opposed to when people talk about the global north and I say, well, what do I do? I'm in the south, in the north, and et cetera, et cetera. But whatever you say, I've seen no sense that those issues, all of those issues within the United States, the centers, the global north are being ignored. I do think it's when you look at the people who may be mostly from wealthy
hmm,
backgrounds and maybe mostly white who are protesting, if you're seeing them only within the context of the United States, you might want to say, oh, those hippies are going to go to law school when they turn 25, and maybe that's true. But if you see that they're trying to focus your attention on the global inequality,
yeah,
that's I there's no way to spend enough time, and you and I have talked about this briefly before, on the inequalities on the global system and the way that so much of the good old democratic socialist world that we would want within our countries would do nothing or might even be harmful. Corbyn and to a certain extent Bernie Sanders, both for reasons that no, good historical reasons, were both skeptical of open borders policies, and they were both they were trying to protect their working class
mm,
constituents at a time when it seemed like everyone else in those respective countries were absolutely attacking those same members of the working class, unless you want to say that Trump was supporting them by bamboozling them.
mm,
But to hear that kind of thing, like we need to close the borders to protect the working class of Britain, that's the thing that I feel like is missing the true class element. Because to protect the working class of Britain or to protect the working class of the United States without doing anything to deal with the global
mm,
indignities and injustices is not to change anything in any useful way, as far as
yeah.
I'm concerned.
And it's actually, I mean, it speaks to a much older politics as well, which was the sort of 19th century trade union politics of,
Yes, I know.
yeah, it's no, it's a false economy.
Oh, absolutely. And you, after 1999, you should not be able to sustain that false economy. And I don't need to spend any more time talking about Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, but they were people whose ideas were probably pretty well formed by 1999.
Yeah,
I would guess, and that's one of the reasons why eventually we're going to have generational change in our political leadership. Eventually,
yeah.
someday. And oh, I guess you guys did. I won't mention your current prime minister. Unless by the time this airs, who knows? Maybe he won't be the prime minister anymore. Um, we've spoken for a little while. We could certainly go on longer, but I like occasionally making slightly shorter episodes.
Sure.
Although this might, I have one more question, which is, how do you, Ruth? How do you talk to a progressive, a good, Jeremy Corbyn voter who, wishes that labor was stronger and blah 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 and et cetera, but still finds the concept, the idea of anarchism silly, misguided, counterproductive, on the road to fascism? I have these conversations all the time. They're not usually very productive. So perhaps I'm asking just simply for me, and the listeners can also glean something from this. How do you speak to someone who seems to share your view of the world, your broad sense of social solidarity and left wing politics, but whose solutions seem to involve, all of the things us anarchists hate: bureaucracy and the law and
Mm.
the police and all of these things? Can you help me?
So, yeah, it's a tricky question, I think. I suppose I try and um, invite the skeptic to articulate what the fear is. So is
Mm,
this because in the end it seems to me that this is always a kind of a prejudice, isn't it, about um, other people not being rational, or some people will be violent. What do you do about that? Well, you know there are two alternatives. Well, there are three alternatives. You face it directly, you try and talk it out, or you just repress it.
mm.
So what do you want? You just want to continue repressing this as if it doesn't exist? uh, and and I think that's the way I go. I mean, and these arguments are so. I mean, it's another. I mean, these arguments have different iterations. It's like what are you going to do with the slaves when you take away the care system of slavery? Because they won't be able to look after themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's a sort of, what do you do? What do we, it's this sort of, what do you do about the women who are going to have to make a decision about who to vote for when they're just completely incapable? What do you do? It's much better that they're told. It's much better that somebody else takes care of it. And in the end, it's not. It's just not.
Yeah.
And that's not to diminish the significance of the problem that we face. Um, in deeply divided, polarized, armed communities.
Yeah.
But the state is, I mean, that's happening in the state.
Hmm.
That's not a result of anarchic behavior. And so the question is, how do we deal with it? Not how does an anarchist deal with it in an anarchist society. The question is, how do we deal with it now? And what do you want to do? You want to just lock everybody up?
Yeah. I think the first of all, I think that's a great answer, and that's going to help me in these conversations. Secondly, I think the question of abolition is a wonderful one because as a historian of 19th century America, I'm very familiar with these debates, and you have people who are, of course, against slavery, but they'll say like, well, we can't. They would say they are not abolitionists because abolition was, kind of capital A abolition was end slavery now.
Mm,
And they would say, if we did that, there's going to be chaos, disorder, violence. They are absolutely correct. That would happen, but it's either a problem of courage
mm,
or simply a problem of the imaginary to say, yes, you're absolutely right. There will be violence and terror if we end slavery overnight in 1855.
mm.
What do you think we have right now in
Yeah,
1855, if not
all those things.
terror and violence organized in such a way that there's no potential to resolve that,
Mm,
and so that terror and violence will go in perpetuity?
mm,
It's scary, especially for those of us living comfortable lives, to unleash the forces of terror and violence. But I do think it's important to remind people that the forces of terror and violence are there right now. They're
exactly.
on they're on a leash,
Mm,
and people like you and I are part of the system that is holding
mm,
the leash. I mean, our elected representatives are the ones with the leash, and that's a hard thing to get someone to acknowledge that they are
yep,
part of that. And
yep.
even if they can't acknowledge it, it's a hard thing to get them to say, you know what? let's find out what happens if you end these systems of oppression. But the alternative is to just say, I think, if you reach this point of clarity, is to say, yeah, I'm okay with current oppression that I am responsible for and benefiting from, as opposed to an unknown future. But
Yes,
if you really
or I think
go
that's
ahead.
exactly, and I think that's the kind of the nub of the critique of representation, isn't it? That it enables people to say, this isn't my problem.
Mm.
Somebody else is going to deal with it. So I don't have to worry about what goes on in these institutions because I just know that they're there. And I guess what the anarchist is saying is, but you have to be responsible for them.
Yeah, we are all responsible
Yeah.
for them. And anarchism says you can do something about it.
Yes,
You,
that's right.
not your representative,
Yeah.
you, and you can do something about it today.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like we found some value in intellectual anarchism, I would say.
I hope so.
Ruth, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, but more importantly, for all that you do and have done. I so enjoy our talks.
Yeah, me too.